Hello everyone. This is the fourth part of the story, A Wizard's Secret. Chapter 21, The Matrix. Instruction confirmed. Initiating the Matrix. Scanning owner's identity. Creating folders. Owner's identity confirmed. Do you want to bind account? After a long while, a monotonous digital voice rang again and echoed in Merlin's head. Yes. Merlin did not hesitate. He knew once he had bound his credentials, he would be able to use the matrix. Others could not even see it because this advanced quantum calculator was injected into the blood in the form of liquefied metal. It merged completely in the flesh and blood of the owner and no one could destroy it. Collecting blood samples. Binding successful. Reading folder. Folder crashed. Building a new folder. Please name the new folder. New folder, huh? Merlin's eyes shone and said in a deep voice, folder name Merlin. Naming new folder successful. Welcome, Mr. Merlin, to use the matrix, the quantum calculator. At this time, the voice of the matrix had turned into a sweet girl's voice. Her voice sounded relaxing. Merlin was sitting on the high wooden chair quietly. Although he seemed calm, his shining eyes had betrayed the excitement he felt on the inside. For a spellcaster to construct a suitable spell model, he would need to spend a few dozen years to make all sorts of simulation and calculation of the spell model. Even so, many final spell model of the spellcasters was still not satisfying. The creation of spell model had wasted many of the spellcasters' time. Now, Merlin had this quantum calculator with him. It represented the most advanced technology in his previous life. With its aid, maybe Merlin would not need to waste much energy on creating a spell model. Anyhow, let's test it. Let's see if the matrix is useful. Though excited, Merlin still kept his head cool. He knew he had to use the matrix to test these spell models. He needed to see if this could work. Merlin immediately ordered the matrix create a fireball database. The matrix immediately began its scan and recorded all the spell models of fireball that Old Man Etha had studied for years into the database. Fireball database successfully created. Immediately analyze these spell models. Along with Merlin's order, the powerful quantum calculator began its work. Its speed was unfathomably fast. In the blink of an eye, the matrix had immediately created up to 10,000 of spell models for Fireball with Old Man Etha's spell models as the base. On top of that, the number was still increasing. Analysis completed. In total, 186,519 models created. Hearing the voice of the matrix, even Merlin was dumbfounded. 180,000 spell models. Just from Old Man Etha's few spell models as the foundation, 180,000 new spell models were created. This was the forte of this calculator. If it was pure manpower, they could not have thought of all the possibilities no matter how creative they were or how strong their mind power was, not to mention creating 180,000 spell models. Of course, most of the spell models found were not what Merlin needed. Merlin still had to filter the overall best and the most suitable spell model for himself. Merlin thought the first element of choosing a spell model was its stability, not power. With stability as the foundation, he would increase the strength of the spell. Spell model created from this line of thought would be the best spell model for him. Merlin closed his eyes. With a serious look on him, he placed his hands lightly on the table, hitting a frequent yet dynamic rhythm. This was Merlin's habit. Whenever he was thinking and preparing to make a decision, he would naturally do this action. After a long while, Merlin opened his eyes and said, "The matrix, use the spell models in the database and choose all spell models that have stability above spell model number 1. Merlin's so-called spell model number 1 meant the spell model created by Old Man Etha with the highest stability. It was the one Old Man Etha was most satisfied with among all. Its specialty was its stability. Once he simulated it in his mind with mind power, the possibility of it falling apart was very low. Merlin's choice was undoubtedly focused on stability. Without chasing after the mere strength of a spell, Merlin knew only a stable spell model would be a good foundation for higher-level spell model in the future. This was just like a building. Zero-level spell model was the foundation. The more stable the foundation, the higher the building could be possibly built in the future. Merlin had thought a lot about it before making the decision. Filtering begin. D. In total, 138 spell models are more stable than spell model number 1. The Matrix had completed filtering in lightning speed. In addition, the result also surprised Merlin. There were 138 spell models that were more stable than the spell model created by Old Man Etha after building it for several years. This was the effect of high-speed calculation incomparable to the human mind no matter what. From these filtered results, Merlin wanted to filter them further. From these spell models, choose the spell model that causes stronger explosion than number 13. Merlin issued his order to the Matrix. Number 13 was the most powerful model among the spell models created by Old Man Etha. However, its structure was greatly unstable. Once number 13 was forcefully used, it could fall apart easily. Since it was highly dangerous, Old Man Etha advised in his spell manual numerous times against choosing such spell model which was easily collapsible. D. Filtered ended. There's no spell model that fits the criteria. Merlin frowned. There was no spell model among these 138 that was stronger than number 13. However, after some thoughts, he calmed down. A spell model that was stable and powerful was not easy to find. Stability and strength, one could only choose one trait or reach a compromise. After understanding this point, Merlin continued his order, change of filter criteria. Find the strongest one among these 138 spell models. Soon, an extremely complicated spell model appeared in Merlin's head. It was the spell model that the Matrix had found which fit Merlin's criteria. This spell model was stable enough. As for its power, Merlin thought about it, then asked the Matrix softly, as compared to number 13, how strong is this spell model? According to the structure of this spell model, this spell model's strength was about 70% of number 13. 70%? More than enough. It's much better than Teacher Etha's spell model number 1. Merlin sighed in relief. It was good enough to have 70% of the strength of spell model number 13, and it was far stronger than Old Man Etha's spell model number 1. Then, Merlin closed his eyes slightly. He began to carefully study this spell model that was chosen from 180,000 spell model where it was deemed the most suitable for Merlin. Moreover, this spell model could be considered as the best compromise between stability and strength. The spell models Old Man Etha used a few dozen years to create could not compare to the spell model that was created using the Matrix in a short amount of time. After choosing the spell model, the last step was to simulate it in his mind with mind power. This process was the step that took the longest time to complete and easiest to fail. If he had weak mind power, even remembering the complex spell model would be difficult, not to mention simulating it in his mind. That would be more than difficult. Although Old Man Etha had left a note noting Merlin's strong mind power and his potential to become a spellcaster, Merlin had to complete the last step to become a true spellcaster. Thus, Merlin closed his eyes in silence and focused his mind. He began to simulate the spell model of zero-level Fireball. The spell model modified by the Matrix was even more complex as compared to Old Man Etha's spell model. It was even difficult to draw all the curved lines on a paper, and moreover, he had to simulate it with mind power. Facing such a complicated spell model, the consumption of mind power was beyond imagination. Merlin had already felt the exhausting effect from trying to simulate the spell model with mind power. 1 hour, 2 hours. Snow suddenly fell outside the window, and so, the temperature in the house seemed lower. Merlin had sat on the wooden chair for 2 to 3 hours. His legs were numb from the cold, but he could not feel a thing right now. This was because his attention was all focused on the spell model in his head. After simulating it repeatedly, Merlin finally felt a slight change in his awareness. Awareness was the place where mind power resided and was the most mysterious place in the brain. The spell model in which Merlin simulated with mind power had taken its form by now and appeared in the empty awareness. Finally, it's done. Suddenly, Merlin opened his eyes. His voice even trembled from excitement. Finally, after spending 3 hours, Merlin had successfully simulated the spell model of Fireball in his mind with mind power. As soon as the spell model had formed its shape, Merlin had a feeling that was slightly different than before. Even though he had sat without moving for a few hours and his limbs had gone cold, but now there seemed to be a ball of heat surrounding him. He could see it if he closed his eyes. The spell model of Fireball in his awareness was spinning slowly right now. There seemed to be a small spark of fire being absorbed into the spell model from the outside. That fire spark made Merlin thought of fire element. When Merlin was asking Macy how he could sense fire element, Macy had described the shape of fire element. Since Merlin did not possess an affinity to the fire element, he could not attract fire element into his body by nature, so he could not become an elemental swordsman. However, now that he had the spell model of Fireball, he could feel endless fire element entering his body in a frenzy. They were rapidly merging into the Fireball spell model. It was as if the spell model in the awareness was a black hole, crazily engulfing the endless fire element around it. Chapter 22 Fireball Spell. It was chilly outside the castle. Snow was falling heavily and formed a thin layer of frost on the ground. However, Merlin could not feel the cold at all. Instead, he felt overly warm. He even took off his thick coat, leaving only a thick shirt on. The spell model of Fireball finally formed in his awareness. What Merlin was about to do now was to test the strength of the Fireball. Merlin scanned the room. His surrounding was not suitable for him to do the Fireball testing, so Merlin wore his coat and headed out. He recalled there was a secret basement in Wilson Castle. It was very hidden and wide. Only old Wilson, the butler, and Merlin knew about this basement. Merlin wanted to test the Fireball, and the basement was the perfect place for him. Recalling his memory, Merlin went straight to old Wilson's room. He pressed a brick on the wall lightly. That was the switch that gave the way to the basement. Ka-chuck. With a creak, a wall in old Wilson's room gradually pulled apart from two sides. Dust flew about and fell on the ground. In a couple of moments, a dark tunnel stood before Merlin. He took a candlestick on old Wilson's table and lit the candles. With the weak light, he walked into the opening. The passage was extremely dark as no one had come in for a long time. There was a heavy and unbearable stench in it. Merlin proceeded cautiously without stopping. This passage headed downward. A long stone staircase led him to a place 100 meters below ground. At two sides of the passage, there were many candlesticks. Whenever Merlin met a candlestick, he would light the candles. Thus, the dark passage turned bright and clear as he walked further. Walking on for a few minutes, the stone staircase had disappeared and Merlin had reached a wide basement. This basement was just a hall. There were more than 10 small rooms storing weapons, shield, and armors. Merlin could still recall the few times he was brought here by old Wilson when he was 10 years old. When old Wilson was repairing the castle, he had referenced the structure of a few military fortresses. Thus, there was a basement which only allowed one person to enter. If there was any danger, one could simply hide in it. If one had prepared way beforehand and stocked the basement, the supplies here would be enough to feed a few hundred people for a year. However, many years had passed. Blackwater City was peaceful without many wars, so the basement was gradually neglected. Albeit neglected, the basement provided enough space for Merlin to test the power of Fireball. Thus, Merlin stood at the center of the underground hall and began to sense the spell model in his awareness quietly. The spell model in his awareness was still rotating slowly. Even the slightest fire element underground was absorbed into the spell model. The fire element that was absorbed by the spell model was the magic power of the spellcaster itself. The longer the time spell model existed, the more the magic power it accumulated. So, once the spell model was created in the awareness, one could just leave it alone. The spell model would automatically accumulate magic power. Merlin read Old Man Etha's spell manual carefully and was clear about the method to cast a spell. It was easy where he would need to stimulate the spell model with mind power. Fireball! Merlin shouted. His mind power directly stimulated the spell model of Fireball. In the blink of an eye, a fireball which emitted scorching heat appeared from the empty space less than a meter away from Merlin. Merlin was filled with elation, but he was not able to control his mind power, so the fireball dissipated as quickly as it had been formed. The fireball dissipated because Merlin had not controlled his mind power properly. Once the fireball was cast, the spellcaster had to control it with his mind power. Even though he failed the first time, Merlin did not give up. He concluded his experience and lesson and cast another fireball. This time, he controlled the fireball well with his mind power and began to direct the fireball to fly around in the air. Boom! The fireball crashed into a stone wall. This fireball in the size of a fist seemed to contain a large amount of energy. It caused the tough wall to tremble and burned a half-inch hole in it. That was not enough to show the true strength of Fireball. Merlin took a heavy armor from the storeroom in the basement. This was the standard equipment of a heavy armored knight. Once he had this on, even the sharp knight's spear could not pierce his armor. It was naturally just right for Merlin to use this armor to test the power of Fireball. He hung the armor on the wall, but he did not continue to cast Fireball. Instead, he sat down for a rest. Merlin rubbed his head with both hands. Since he had cast Fireball for 2 times, he realized the magic power accumulated in the spell model had been emptied. If he wanted to cast it again, he would need to wait for his magic power to recover. Looking at the spell model in his awareness, which absorbed the fire element from outside slowly, Merlin thought to himself as he murmured, "It seems like the time is too short since the creation of the spell model. I can only cast Fireball for 2 times. As for lack of magic power, Merlin could not do anything. The accumulation of magic power could only rely on the time the spell model was given to accumulate. There was no shortcut to it. After an hour, the spell model slowly recovered. Merlin could cast Fireball once again. Go! Merlin cast it again. This time, he was already familiar with the casting of Fireball, so he could do it swiftly. He controlled the Fireball in front of him and smashed it into the armor on the wall. SSSS. There was no huge noise as he had imagined. A fist-like hole burnt through the protection of the armor that covered the front chest by the small fireball. The hole was still hissing smoke. Even Merlin had broken into a cold sweat. He was aghast. Even though he had assumed the strength of the fireball would be remarkable, he did not expect it to be this powerful. This was a heavy armor made from iron. Its defense was top-notch among other armor. Even the knight's spear could not pierce it. However, the fireball could easily burn a hole in an armor of such defense. The small fireball Merlin cast contained a terrifying power and temperature. What's this? Merlin came back to his senses. When he was checking the spell model in his awareness, he found something new. In his awareness, there was a gray horizontal frame beside the slowly rotating spell model. Merlin was worried about the appearance of this gray frame in his awareness, especially near his spell model. When does this appear? Merlin furrowed his eyebrows. He remembered clearly that this gray frame was not there when he built the spell model. It must have appeared lately. Thus, he observed it more closely. He realized half of this gray frame was slightly bright while the other part remained dull. Merlin observed for a long time, but he still did not know what this frame was, nor did he know when it had appeared in his awareness. However, he did not plan to waste his time studying this frame. He needed to spend a long time trying to familiarize the process of casting the fireball. Thus, Merlin released the fireball again. His mind power guided the fireball and crashed it into the heavy armor. Boom! This time, the whole fireball exploded and flew all over the place. Even the armor with high defense strength was blown into pieces. This was the effect of mind power. Not only could it guide the direction of the spell, but also made many changes to it. For example, he could let the fireball explode when it approached the enemy. If he needed to deal with hard objects, he would not let it explode, and instead, he would burn a hole through it due to the heat. These were all techniques used in casting spells. It required long practices and battle experiences to gradually discover all effects of spells. Since Merlin had just built his spell model, he would usually empty his magic power after casting 2 fireballs. He must rest during this time to wait for his magic power to recover. If he forcefully stimulated the spell model, he could cause the spell model to fall apart and caused a detrimental effect on the spellcaster indirectly. These taboos during the process of casting spells were recorded in detail in Old Man Etha's spell manual. Merlin had memorized all by heart. When he was resting, Merlin found the gray frame again in his awareness. However, the strange thing was that the frame was no longer gray. It had become red. Looking at the red frame, Merlin had a strange feeling, so he tried to touch it with his mind power. Boom! After being stimulated by Merlin's mind power, the red frame shone a bright light. The static spell model, which was slowly recovering, suddenly spun in a fast movement. At the same time, the magic power that had recovered was rapidly emptied by spell model. Before Merlin even understood what was going on, a large fireball immediately appeared in front of him. It slowly hovered in the air, and its internal part seemed greatly unstable. It seemed it was about to explode any time. Merlin gawked at the large fireball in shock. If his previous fireballs were the size of a fist, then this fireball was almost the size of 3 to 4 fists. Not good. The fireball was not guided by Merlin's mind power. Moreover, its internal part seemed greatly unstable and seemed as if it might explode any time. Merlin felt a sense of danger and immediately directed the fireball with his mind power to collide with the ground. Chapter 23: The Incident Part. Vroom! A huge yet heavy noise rang. It was as if the whole basement was shaking. After a while, Merlin stood up from the ground. He patted his head slightly to find that his head and clothes were covered with dust. The place where the large fireball collided with directly caused a gigantic hole, almost half a meter in diameter. It only showed what terrifying power was contained within that fireball just now. Merlin quickly checked his awareness. He noticed that the frame had turned gray again. Meanwhile, the spell model remained the same except that it had exhausted its magic power. Looking at the gigantic hole, Merlin still felt overwhelmed. The power of that fireball was out of his expectation, and its appearance must be closely related to the horizontal frame that appeared out of nowhere in his awareness. After that, Merlin tried all ways to observe the change of frame in his awareness. Finally, Merlin found the usage of the frame. It turned out that after Merlin had cast fireball for 3 times, the color of the frame would turn from gray to red. At this time, once he used mind power to stimulate the frame, the spell model would be triggered and released a gigantic fireball. Its power was terrifying and at least 3 times stronger than the normal fireball. Merlin could not understand the reason behind the appearance of the frame. Maybe it was because the Matrix had redesigned the spell model. Or maybe it was because Merlin had passed through from another life. However, no matter what, this frame at least brought a great advantage to Merlin. It could bring out a spell which had a force 3 times greater than that of any normal 0-level spell. Even though Merlin did not know how strong a first-level spell was, the fireball created from triggering the frame would not be any less than the first-level spell. Moreover, this was Merlin's hidden power. He could use it as his trump card. With the gigantic fireball released by the frame in mind, Merlin named this triggered fireball as Large Fireball since the name fit the image well. Merlin then continued his fireball practice in the basement. When the night had fallen, Merlin was bending over his writing desk under the weak candlelight. He was flipping through the final volume of the spell manual carefully. Old Man Etha's spell manual consisted of 3 volumes. The first volume talked about his introduction about spell casters and his experience of casting spells. The second volume recorded all sorts of spell models in which Old Man Etha had spent years to create relentlessly. Merlin had completed reading the first 2 volumes of the spell manual. He had rebuilt his spell model and even simulated the spell model of Fireball in his awareness. However, during his practice of Fireball in the basement, he found some weaknesses he had currently. The most crucial weakness was his lack of mind power. Spell model determined whether a person could become a spellcaster, while mind power determined whether the spellcaster could become a strong one. So, a strong spellcaster must be excellent in both creating spell model and using mind power. Only with this, he could be able to overcome all difficulties and become the ever-strong spellcaster. To increase his mind power, his only way was to meditate. Merlin's current mind power could barely control a spell model. If he wanted to construct a second spell model in his awareness, he would not be able to do it. Thus, Merlin decided to read through Old Man Etha's spell manual. He believed that Old Man Etha must have left a mind meditation method in his spell manual. Merlin slowly flipped the mysterious 3rd volume open. From just a few pages, he found a few mind meditation methods, but according to these notes, these were only beginner methods where their effects were limited. These methods had their own specialties. Some specialized in mind power recovery. Once he had exhausted his mind power, he could recover himself quickly through this method. Some could increase mind power. This was what Merlin needed, mind meditation method that could increase mind power. After careful consideration, Merlin chose a beginner meditation method and began to do as this method told. He closed his eyes and maintained the steady state of his mind power. Mind meditation method like this had to be practiced for a long time to properly induce a change. So, after Merlin had grasped the steps of this method, he opened his eyes and stood up. He did not check the state of his mind power since he did not expect the method to have any immediate effect. Young Master Merlin. Outside his door, Lucia's voice reached him. Come in. Merlin had already woken up and dressed properly by now. Lucia pushed the door open and entered the room with her head lowered. She said to Merlin, Young Master Merlin, the butler asked me to take young master's body measurement so that we can make some clothes for you. Merlin lowered his head to look at his body. He felt it too recently. The clothes on him seemed to be slightly smaller. For some reason, his body shape had turned muscular rapidly in these few months, as if he was an inflated balloon. His usual clothes seemed to be ill-fitting and restricted his movement greatly. All right. Merlin hesitated for a moment, but he still took his coat off. Wearing only a thin shirt, he opened his arms wide and signaled for Lucia to take his body measurement. Lucia came forward hurriedly. With a body tape measure, she measured Merlin's height. Merlin had become a lot taller in these few months, so Lucia was unable to reach his head. She could only stand on tiptoe and stood lightly against Merlin's front chest and measured Merlin's height in difficulty. Lucia was raising her head as she measured it. She wore her white maid uniform and the neckline was rather wide. Merlin could see her fair skin the moment he lowered his head for just a little. Lucia was a beautiful woman to begin with. She had freckles on her face which did not affect her beauty, but it made her look fetching. Merlin squinted his eyes while his unscrupulous gaze fell all over Lucia. Suddenly, even if it was freezing outside of the castle, Merlin felt a scorching heat rising in his body. "Young Master Merlin, I'm done." Lucia seemed to notice Merlin's stare and she looked nervous. She took a few steps back and lowered her head. She did not dare to look at Merlin. "All right. You may go now." Merlin waved his hand and asked Lucia to leave. He walked in front of the mirror and stared at his young face. Merlin smiled a little and mumbled to himself, "It seems I've abstained for too long." Since Merlin had arrived in this world, he had always felt a sense of danger. No matter what he did it carefully, and because of that, he seemed meticulous and cautious. Then, he found magic and immersed himself in it. However, this body was only 16 years old. It was the age that was filled with passion and excitement. Even if he did not have those thoughts, his body would react nonetheless. Merlin wore his coat back and went downstairs, but he did not find Macy anywhere in sight. "Butler, where's Macy?" Young Lady Macy had left for the church. Merlin nodded. He had been busy practicing fireball for this whole month, sometimes not even seeing Macy at all. However, since Macy had been going out early and coming back late every day, it seemed like she had not overcome the barrier to become an elemental swordsman. Merlin only knew a little about elemental swordsmen. To overcome the barrier to become one, Merlin was unsure about the exact ways as well. However, he knew the most important thing to be an elemental swordsman was the accumulation of element. Only when the element had been stored in the body to a certain extent, she could become an elemental swordsman. Macy had an affinity to fire element, so she needed to accumulate fire element. Merlin's spell model in his awareness also absorbed fire element. Both matters should have something in common. When Macy is back, let's find a time and test it out. Let's see if I can help her to overcome the barrier to become an elemental swordsman. Merlin decided in his heart. After having breakfast, Merlin wore a gray scarf and headed straight out of the castle. The butler asked in surprise, "Young Master Merlin, you're heading out?" "I'm going out for a walk." "Young Master Merlin, please wait. Let me call Moss." Merlin shook his head. "Don't have to. I want to go for a walk by myself." After that, he left the castle directly despite the butler's surprise. Merlin walked for a while and reached Old Man Etha's small wooden house. Staring at the small house, Merlin had a complicated expression. The small house had been abandoned completely because this was the place where the evil heretic had lived, so there was no one around. The garden in front of the small house still had some flowers, but they were covered by snow at the moment where it formed a blanket of whiteness. Merlin stuck his hands into his pocket. With a hat on him, he looked around the place. After making sure there was no one around, he pushed the rusty iron fence open and climbed the wooden stairs. Merlin took off his hat and gently brushed the snow off. He raised his head and took a glance at the second floor. When he was about to go upstairs, suddenly his expression stiffened as he squinted his eyes. Footsteps. "Someone's here." Merlin said it softly. He noticed a series of clear footsteps on the supposedly dusty staircase. Moreover, the footsteps were covered in moist mud. Obviously, these footsteps were not left here a long time ago. Someone was here. The person might even be upstairs now. So Merlin looked upstairs cautiously. Then, he wore his hat lightly and went up softly and quietly. The footsteps still seemed clear as no one had cleaned the house for a long time. So, the stairs were exceptionally dusty. That was how he was able to spot the footsteps so clearly. Reaching the second floor, Merlin checked the door handle carefully. There was almost no dust on it. Someone had opened this door by this handle. Who is it? Merlin did not enter the room bluntly. He squinted his eyes. In his mind, multiple familiar figures flashed across his eyes. The footsteps looked small. Rather than a man's footsteps, it seemed more likely to be a woman's. Could it be Miss Chorus? Merlin could not help but think of Chorus. After all, Old Man Etha was the evil heretic. People of Blackwater City would not come to this place at all. The people who were friendly with Old Man Etha and used to frequent this place was Merlin and Chorus. Right at this time, Merlin's sharp hearing suddenly caught the soft sound of footsteps outside of the house. Someone was heading toward the main door. Merlin responded swiftly and hid on the left side of the main door. His eyes stared at the main door sharply. Chapter 24, The Incident Part 2. Merlin listened closely to the sounds in the house. Since he had practiced the posture of that mysterious relief sculpture relentlessly, Merlin's senses had been greatly sharpened. He could hear any slight sounds in the house. Why isn't there any sound? Merlin frowned. He heard a series of light footsteps just now, and it seemed the person had reached the door. Suddenly, all sounds had stopped. Boom! With a loud bang, the wooden door beside Merlin was smashed broken by someone, sending the broken wooden debris flying around. Following that, a hand quickly reached out from the hole made in the wooden door. A white light flashed by. Phew! It was a sharp dagger headed directly toward Merlin. I have been found. Merlin immediately realized that he had been found out. The dagger came at him at the speed of lightning. Merlin could not even defend against it. The only thing he could do was to roll sideways, barely dodging the hit. Fuck! Merlin was so infuriated that he spat out a curse. He almost got killed even before he had a clear view of the person's face. It turned out he was still too clueless. After that, Merlin did not wait for his doom. Instead, his body curled up like a fierce leopard and dashed toward the wooden door brutally with his explosive strength. Ka-chuck! The wooden door was completely destroyed by this hit. Merlin felt himself crashing into a soft body, bringing the person into the wooden house. The wooden house was dark with all the curtains shut tight. They must have been shut off by the people from the city defense troop. The whole house was almost sealed off. Moreover, since the place was not ventilated for a long time, the house reeked of an unbearable, moldy stench. After crashing into the person, Merlin quickly jumped up from the ground. His alerted gaze set tightly on the person as he asked, "Who are you?" The secret person in front of him wore a long black coat. The wide coat had covered his body shape so her figure could not be seen. Also, she wore a large, black cloak over her head so her face could not be seen. Faced with Merlin's question, the secret person did not speak. Instead, she held up her dagger. Her wide black coat slowly began shaking. It was as though there were gusts of wind blowing beside her. Wind element? Elemental swordsman? Merlin was already extremely sensitive toward elements. The wind element on the person was extremely strong and surrounded her completely. She was an elemental swordsman. From the wave of wind element about her, she should just be a first-level elemental swordsman. Swoosh! Her figure flashed when her speed had reached its peak. In the dark wooden house, Merlin still could not grasp the secret person's figure even when his senses had already been sharpened greatly. His opponent's speed was simply too quick. Merlin could only stay still and remain imperturbable in this incident. Once he sensed some movements near him, he would send his fist that way without thinking. However, each punch seemed to only hit empty air. This made Merlin fairly upsetting because all his strength had not been put to correct use. Tisk! Suddenly, Merlin felt a chill at his neck. A sense of immediate danger could be felt and he quickly turned his neck sideways. The sharp dagger directly pierced Merlin's skin. It was great fortune that Merlin was able to dodge in time. Moreover, his body had become extremely sturdy due to the practice of posture. So, this attack only ended in a scratch. However, this made Merlin break into a cold sweat. Just by a small margin, his neck would have been pierced. Damn it! Too fast! Merlin cursed in a low voice. His opponent was a wind swordsman that specialized in speed. Her figure that came and went like a shadow was simply too quick. Merlin even had difficulty to catch the person's figure by sight, not to mention getting a hit. The house was too dark. Under such an environment, fighting with a wind swordsman only put him in a disadvantaged situation. Thinking about that, Merlin turned around abruptly and dashed outside. Hoo-hoo! However, the secret person's speed seemed to be quicker. She came right in front of Merlin and stabbed at Merlin's chest. Got you. Go to hell. Merlin's mouth quirked into a smile. With the light by the door, he could clearly see the shadow in front of him. This was the time he struck. Fireball. A fireball appeared out of nowhere and flew right at the secret person. The flying fireball emitted terrifying temperature and was more apparent in the dark house. The fireball's speed was quick. The person also seemed to be shocked by the fireball that appeared abruptly. She only managed to dodge sideways as the fireball got a direct hit on the person's black cloak. The heat given off by the fireball was extremely high. Without almost anything to stop it, it quickly burnt off half the person's black cloak, revealing her beautiful blonde, long hair. The house was still dark. Although Merlin could not see the person's facial expressions, he could guess that the person must be aghast. When the person was still in shock, Merlin dashed forward. With his hands like leaf fan, he caught hold of her long coat and smashed her onto the ground. Bang! Merlin's strength was exceptionally strong. She was immediately thrown into a state of confusion from this smash. Still, she was an elemental swordsman nonetheless. Her physical attributes were still excellent, so she still had the energy to stab at Merlin's neck. Humph! Merlin groaned as his left hand grabbed the person's and his right hand grabbed her hair. Without the slightest hesitation, he smashed her head into the wall. Bang bang bang! After smashing her in the wall consecutively for 3 times, the secret person no longer struggled and went slumped. Merlin only stopped after seeing that. Merlin took in large mouthfuls of breath. This was his first time facing such a dangerous opponent. Moreover, it was a matter of life and death. Although in terms of their actual strength, Merlin was a strong wizard who could easily win against any first-level and second-level elemental swordsman, he almost died in the person's hand just now. If he could not apply his spells in real battles, then it would be totally useless even if he got hold of strong spells. Old Man Etha had only grasped 2 0-level spells back then. He was the same as Merlin, an entrance-level spellcaster. Amongst the ranking of spellcaster, entrance level could be counted as non-professional. Those entrance-level spellcaster could not even be counted as true spellcaster. Only those who had grasped 3 0-level spells and had upgraded all 3 into first-level spells were able to become first-level spellcaster. Even if Old Man Etha was only an entrance-level spellcaster, he still dealt with the Guardian Swordsman from Grand City with ease. Even second-level elemental swordsman like Swordsman Bog was far from being his opponent. This also proved the strength of the spellcasters. It was not something that could be compared to elemental swordsmen. However, Merlin was almost killed by a first-level elemental swordsman today. This showed how alarmingly lacking he was in terms of battle experiences. In the beginning, he did not even have a chance to cast his spell. As a spellcaster, this was a deadly weak point. Merlin touched his neck with his palm. He could feel some thick blood flowing out of it, but it was simply a small cut on the surface. Moreover, there was no more blood, so the figure was fine. This was a great lesson to be learned. If I have cast Fireball and blasted the door open in the beginning, he won't be able to hurt me regardless of his speed. Merlin was concluding his weakness from the battle just now. He had not gotten used to his identity as spellcaster and his habit to attack first. Spellcaster should finish his enemy off from afar, not fighting close combat with an elemental swordsman. The woman in a black clothing was still lying on the ground. Since she was smashed by Merlin for a few times, it might still take a while for her to regain consciousness. Thus, Merlin stood up and approached her. He uncovered half of the black cloak that remained on her. After fighting for such a long time, Merlin had not gotten a close look at her face. The black cloak was uncovered, revealing her blonde hair in which a part of it was burnt. The hair was still releasing a burnt odor. Too bad she had such a beautiful hair. Merlin shook his head slightly as he praised this beautiful, long hair. It was a shame that Merlin's fireball had burnt a part of such beautiful hair. The blonde hair also appeared slightly black and extremely odd. The person was lying on her side with her hair covering her face. Merlin put her hair slightly off her face and looked at her. Merlin's eyes squinted. His stare became sharp immediately. Gia? The person lying on the ground was, to his surprise, Gia, who taught his history class. Merlin could still recall that even God had not found Gia's true background with his family's influence back then. He did not expect to see Gia at this place. Moreover, according to how she acted, she was not a normal teacher. It was not as simple as that. Just when Merlin was guessing the relationship between Gia and Old Man Etha, Gia groaned slightly and was about to wake up. Merlin stood up and took a step back, with his eyes staring dead at Gia. After a while, Merlin heard Gia's breathing became rapid, so he pulled a light smile. Stop pretending. Why don't you open your eyes if you're awake? Hearing Merlin's words, Gia opened her eyes as expected. She looked at Merlin and said in a calm tone, "Wilson Merlin? I can't believe Mr. Etha has really taken you as his true disciple." Just when Gia was struggling to stand up, Merlin waved his hands. Following his motion, a fireball appeared and directly collided towards the ground beside Gia. Boom! The fireball hit the ground and exploded directly. It blasted a hole off the wooden floor, leaving black smoke sizzling above the hole. Done with the game. Otherwise, the fireball will be exploding on your body the next time. Merlin warned Gia directly with his action. After a month of an excruciating practice of his mind meditation spell, his mind power had finally improved. Most important of all, he was even more skillful in manipulating his fireball so the situation of fireballs going out of control would not happen again. Chapter 25, True Identity. A fireball emitting a scorching heat that was floating around Merlin. Deterred by the fireball, Gia did not dare to move. She only looked at Merlin silently. Merlin nodded in satisfaction and said with a low pitch, "When I ask a question, you answer." Merlin, we are not enemy. You are Mr. Etha's disciple. You? Even before Gia finished her sentences, Merlin waved his hands again. A fireball dived right towards Gia, who was still lying on the ground. She was shocked and quickly shook her dagger, trying to block this fireball. Chink. Although the fireball was only the size of a fist, its temperature was enough to melt iron. Thus, once Gia's dagger met the fireball, it immediately melted into liquid iron. Meanwhile, the small fireball went forward, brushed by Gia's arm and hit the wall. Gia's sleeve was directly burnt off, becoming torn pieces of debris. A black mark was also burnt on her white and delicate arm by that horrifying heat. An odor of grilled meat even filled the wooden house. The excruciating pain made Gia break into a sweat. A tinge of fear was mixed in her gaze at Merlin. Now you should understand. When I ask a question, you answer. Gia gritted her teeth and nodded. She did not dare to utter a single word more. What is your relationship with Teacher Etha? Merlin began the questioning. Gia lightly pulled her body to lean on the wall. She answered, "Mr. Etha is my boss. I work under Mr. Etha. We are sent here by the Kingdom of Black Moon." Merlin finally understood. It turned out Gia and Old Man Etha were the people sent by the Kingdom of Black Moon to the Kingdom of Light to fish for information. No wonder Gut could not attain Gia's background at all. Teacher Etha is found by the church. Why aren't you found as well? We almost never see each other. We have always exchanged information with codes. Mr. Etha is found because he is a spellcaster. Mr. Etha made a trip to Grand City and was accidentally found out by the church. No matter what identity he holds, a spellcaster will be eradicated by the church. If so, the church did not realize Teacher Etha was sent here by the Kingdom of Black Moon? It's simply because his identity as a spellcaster was found out? It should be this way. Or else, with the church's capabilities, I would have been taken away by them a long time ago. Merlin stared right at Gia. From her response, Merlin did not find anything illogical, so her response should be true. Merlin was clear that heretic was not tolerated in the Kingdom of Light. Old Man Etha was also hunted down by the wizard and Inquisitor because his identity as spellcaster was found out. Perhaps even the church had not realized his true identity. Except as a spellcaster, he was also a member of the secret intelligence unit sent by the Kingdom of Black Moon. The atmosphere became heavy. Merlin's silence had caused great unrest in Gia's heart. She knew the man before her was thinking how he should deal with her. Other than you, does anybody else know about Teacher Etha's identity? Merlin thought about it for quite a while. His tone had become stern. If someone still knew about Old Man Etha's identity, then the person might use this fact against him. Merlin did not want to get involved in the matters between the Kingdom of Black Moon and the Kingdom of Light. So, once there was someone who still knew about Old Man Etha's identity around, then Gia could not be left alive. Seemingly realized Merlin's intention, Gia appeared rather flustered. She quickly said, "Except for me, no one else knows about Mr. Etha's identity. Merlin, I am still of use to you. Even though you have become an honorable spellcaster, but in the Kingdom of Light, you are seen as a heretic. You still bear the risk of being found out by the Church of Light any time. With me, at least I can scout for information for you. Until you decided to leave the Kingdom of Light, I can help you to." Gia's pitiful figure and her beautiful face truly hit a soft spot in people's heart. "Get up." Finally, Merlin spoke slowly. The fireball before him also gradually dissipated, turning into a wisp of smoke. "Who?" Gia, who leaned against the wall, finally sighed in relief. She took a large mouthful of breaths as she wiped the cold sweat on her forehead. Holding her injured arm, she stood up in jittery. She stood up, but she did not leave immediately. Instead, she began to take off her clothes. First, she took off the black cloak, revealing a thick, white fur coat. Without the cover-up of the black cloak, Gia's prideful shape then showed itself. Only that she seemed pale and covered with sweat now. It appeared that her arm was badly injured. This made her beauty seem less attractive at this moment. "Please, take care of this for me." Gia pointed to the clothes she had thrown to the floor. There were some blood stains on the black cloak. Wearing that out would alert others without fail. Merlin simply raised his right hand and a fireball flew off instantaneously. It fell on the floor and burnt the clothes in a blink of an eye. Soon, the clothes on the floor had turned to ashes. "I will leave first. The people from City Defense Troop will come around here sometimes. It's not safe here." After saying that, Gia pressed her injured arm lightly and dashed out of the house. Merlin looked at Gia as her figure disappeared out of his sight rapidly. Then, he moved around in Old Man Etha's small house. Almost everything in the house had been moved away. Only the empty room was left about. Seeing that there was nothing more of value left in the house, Merlin was prepared to leave. After all, staying long hours in this place was definitely unsafe, regardless of whether there were people of city defense troop poking around. A beautiful figure went to the streets for a few rounds before pausing. It was Gia, who had just left the small house. Gia bit her lips as her arm was still bleeding. The clothes tied around her arm had almost turned red. She turned around to look at the direction of Old Man Etha's wooden house and groaned. She cursed in a soft voice, "Idiot." After that, Gia seemed to have touched her injury again, causing her unimaginable pain. She could only lean against the wall and slowly moved towards one of the courtyards in front. The courtyard had a high fence built around it. There was a classic-styled penthouse inside. The environment was comfortable, but the garden was empty. Not a single human could be seen. Gia held her arm as she entered the garden totteringly. At this moment, the clothes could no longer stop the bleeding wound. Drops of blood dripped onto the ground. It was a ghastly sight to behold. Master Roland. Gia came to the small house, but she did not knock. Instead, she called out softly with respect. "Gia, are you hurt?" "What happened?" A husky voice came from within the house. It came with a tone of shock. "Master Roland, when I went to Mr. Etha's house, I saw Wilson Merlin. I can't believe Mr. Etha actually took Wilson Merlin as his true disciple. He is now a spellcaster. I was hurt by him." Gia explained the incident briefly. The person in the house said slowly after a long pause, "These spellcasters are always reckless and unscrupulous. They don't think for the kingdom at all. Old Etha even went to Grand City without warrant for a casting tool. In the end, he is found out by the Church of Light. Poof. Thank goodness he is dead now. He didn't give away us. Or else, our effort in these few years are all in vain." Master Roland in the house seemed to be resentful against spellcasters, especially Old Man Etha. Gia did not dare to discuss such a matter much. No matter if it was spellcaster like Old Man Etha or Master Roland in there, their status was still far above her. After Master Roland ranted about his dissatisfaction with Old Man Etha, he asked in a heavy tone, "This Merlin. Does he know about us?" Gia's expression changed slightly and quickly explained, "Master Roland, Mr. Etha seemed to only teach Merlin about the knowledge of spellcaster. He did not talk about us to Merlin. Otherwise, I am afraid I won't be coming back today. This Merlin is a hidden danger after all. We must not give ourselves away. So, we must eliminate Merlin. Gia, since he has let you go, then he should be less cautious about you. You must find a way to bring him here. Poof. At that time, I will eliminate him myself." Master Roland was full of killing intent. "Master Roland, this Merlin has already become a spellcaster. I am afraid it's not easy to kill him," Gia said, a little worried. "No need to worry. He has just become a spellcaster. Since I am doing it by surprise, killing him is a piece of cake. With his guard off, these spellcasters are nothing different than normies," Master Roland said without a doubt. Gia could only nod, but her expression was a little dark. "Gia, it has been almost a year since you were sent to the Kingdom of Light. I will ask for your return to the higher-ups." Although spoken softly, Gia had heard the words. Her dark expression immediately showed a hint of happiness. Her pale face due to blood loss seemed to recover a little due to her excitement. "Thank you, Master Roland." Upon saying that, Gia left the place quickly. In the Wilson Castle, Merlin returned to his room and took off the scarf lightly. Blood stains could be seen on the scarf. Merlin stood in front of the mirror and looked at the injury on his neck. The cut had already formed a scab and the bleeding had stopped. The cut was not long. It only looked like a cut caused by the branches. Cuts like this would heal completely in 2 days. Not even a scar would be left. Merlin threw the blood-stained scarf into a bowl and threw a fireball into the bowl. Then, the scarf slowly burnt into ashes in the scorching fire. Following that, Merlin opened his window for ventilation. Until the strange odor caused by the burning scarf had disappeared, he opened the door and went downstairs. The butler was still directing the servants in the castle to cut down a huge tree in the yard and move it out of the castle. The tree had collected a thick amount of snow on its branches. Due to the howling wind yesterday, the tree had been uprooted by it, now lying on the ground. Merlin squinted his eyes to see the servants busy running about in sweat. Suddenly, he could hear a series of sound made by horse hooves outside of the castle. Moss' carriage that was sent to pick Macy up had returned. Merlin quickly stood up. The reason he was here was to wait for Macy's return. This marks the end of part 4 of the story A Wizard's Secret. Thank you for listening. Please like the video and hit the subscribe button to listen more. Hit the bell icon to get notified of all the new content uploaded to the channel ASAP.